Pleased to welcome our next speaker, Urke Boyton. So Urke is a professor in cybersecurity and director of the Cyber Technology Institute at De Montfort University in Leicester, as well as head of School of Computer Science and Informatics. He works in the area of cybersecurity and privacy with a particular interest in the policy sides of data, frequently appears in the press and in debates on privacy. Last year, he organised a public letter signed by more than 200 academics expressing concern about privacy in the contact tracing apps that were being developed by NHSX at that time, a topic he'll be talking about today. So over to you, Urke.
Thanks very much, Steve. Thanks for that introduction. I'm going to talk about the topic, general topic, how pandemic has changed the face of cybersecurity and concentrating on the sacrifice of privacy as we've seen it in the UK. And that sounds a little bit provocative, maybe, but you'll get the essence of why that's the point here. And apps and data stores are two of the areas where we've seen something happen, and I will ask at the end, was it worth it? Have we got out of this what we needed to? So yes, as Steve already mentioned, Cyber Technology Institute at Montfort is an academic centre of excellence in cybersecurity research. Just like the Surrey one, and so to start with, when we wrote this letter and we went into the press with it, some of the pushback we got was along the lines of, yeah, but you're looking at privacy at the expense of human lives and things like that. Right, and that's absolutely not the case. In fact, we know that privacy is not an absolute thing. Right? If you look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you will see that privacy is only mentioned in the context of no arbitrary interference. So interference is okay as long as it's not arbitrary. So privacy is not the primary thing, not an absolute thing. And if you look at the GDPR, and I'll come back to GDPR data protection law now and again in this talk, you can see that the processing of data concerning health is in principle prohibited because it's special category data, as it's called, and then the exceptions follow. And one of these exceptions is number 2I, which says when it's necessary for reasons of public interest in the area of public health. Well, I think we were there, right? We are there. So we've had a fantastically interesting year, as Charles already mentioned, in the context of video conferencing. But it was the first time that we had a couple of things happening at the same time. So some of these things were slow in the making, but the combination of all was new. So we have ubiquitous large-scale surveillance from Google and Apple and everybody else, and some of that is a little bit self-imposed. We all carry our little surveillance machine with us, and sometimes we even make phone calls on it. Around that, there's a very highly developed surveillance capitalism ecosystem. So not just Google, not just Apple. There's lots of data going back and forth, and yeah, the world is attuned to doing surveillance, digital surveillance, and doing it in a way that some people make lots of profit from it, and there's lots of data going about, more than we're aware of. On top of that, we've got huge computing power in the world. So weather systems work these days at high precision and high information. And in general, we've got the computing power there. We can deal with millions of data points and maybe trillions or billions. I mean, I'm not really a high performance computing sort of person to say exactly how many zeros there are in that particular line. But lots and lots of data points, and we can deal with them in real time. And then, yeah, okay, some of what I'm saying here is a little bit tongue-in-cheek. Right, so artificial intelligence, has it surpassed human intelligence? Well, at least at playing Go, which I would say is a complex task that involves a bit more than just doing brute large multiplications or whatever. And on top of that, of course, we've also got data protection law that's equipped with all of these, at least in theory. And on top of that, 2020 was the year in which, of course, we got a crisis which, in an ideal world, would require all hands on deck from all these things, gathering lots of data, processing it at high speed, doing clever things with this, and doing all that in a responsible way as well. So it was a perfect moment for all that to come together and produce something really fantastic. Did it? Did it not? Well, so one place to look at is, of course, the whole story of contact tracing apps that Steve already hinted at, that we could hit at it. So I would say the essence of contact tracing app is the processing of people's possible infection status at a large scale, the national scale, and then hopefully, well, we can't do it by hand. We have to take some automatic decisions to restrict individuals' movement. Namely, if we've decided that somebody's potentially infected, then we need to tell them to self-isolate. Right. So this is what a contact tracing app does. This is functionality. This is not. It sounds almost like legalistic language of describing something really bad. But no, this is a good thing. This is what collectively we decide there is this thing called test and trace and whatever, which does need the right data input in order to decide, okay, it is too dangerous for us all now if this particular person moves about. Okay, you can put it a bit more legalistically. So it's the processing of health data, which GDPR says is special category, and I already mentioned it's prohibited to process this unless you've got a very good reason for it. It happens at the national scale. Well, the GDPR has things to say about large-scale processing, so it means that the need for representatives, which is less interesting, need for data protection officers, also slightly less interesting, and the need for data protection impact assessments, which is way more interesting, and I'll come back to. And there's the taking of automated decisions which have a significant impact on people's lives. So the Articles 21 and 22, which are about automated decision making, whether it's a good thing, whether people can opt out from it, and whether it's allowed at all. And I'm not even thinking about children here, by the way. And all of that to restrict individual autonomy. We're telling somebody they can't move anymore. So essentially, we're taking a very, very important right, the right of people to move about where they live away from them, as a consequence of doing all this data processing and the decision making that follows from it. Whereas if you look at Article 1 of the GDPR, it says, well, we should protect people's fundamental rights and freedoms. So I think this, in a nutshell, explains why saying, well, you're trying to do this asking this contact tracing apps to be in a totally privacy preserving way, that and you're doing it at the expense of life. No, not really. We're looking at an application which is intrinsically an enormous breach of privacy, an enormous breach of autonomy, enormous amount of sensitive data processing. But it serves a purpose, and the sort of relative value of privacy means that it is a possibility that seriously needs to be considered. So in England and in the UK, we have some of the following players involved in setting up contact tracing, right? So we have NHS Digital, which has been called HCSC in the past, and has had other names in the past as well. But it's the branch of the NHS that deals with information governance on large scale databases, which has huge experience with it. You will find that privacy people have sometimes criticized them for being a little bit sloppy with giving data, maybe to the wrong people, arguments about whether data is anonymous or not. But roughly speaking, these are the people who take care of the NHS's data, and they know what they're doing, right? I've read assessments which said that actually in the COVID time they've upped their game in terms of information governance. Then there's NHSX, which is a Matt Hancock inspired new branch of the NHS, which is applying artificial intelligence in an NHS way in order to do innovation, transformation, disruption, and all those things which are not intrinsically good but sound flashy. Right? We have the National Cybersecurity Centre, which is a branch of GCHQ, if you like, which is interested in making sure that everything happens well with the critical infrastructure of the country. So that includes health. And then there's Public Health England, which was always responsible for making sure that a crisis like this, the right thing happens. So, and then there's some others on the margins of this. So the thing that happened was Public Health England ruled itself out fairly early on in the crisis, or was ruled out early on in the crisis. They proved their incompetence in terms of information governance by a downright ridiculous privacy notice for the test and trace system, which sank deep and had lots of deep problems in there, including talking about personal identifiable information, which is not a UK term. Sorry, the data protection nerd in me jumping up there. Sorry, there were worse things with that. The other player that was ruled out somehow was NHS Digital, which is sort of shocking. So what are we left with? Well, what we're left with in terms of the start of trying to do a contact tracing app in the UK was basically scientists from the Big Data Institute at the University of Oxford talking to NHSX and an organization whose purpose was to do stuff but not to achieve goals particularly, and to do stuff in a way that's innovative and I would personally call them happy clappy techno solutionists. So they talked to each other, and the Big Data Institute thought we need lots of data, and NHSX thought we want to do something disruptive here, and it might even be useful in the context of the crisis. And then there was the National Cybersecurity Centre, which fortunately was also close at hand, in order to make sure that everything that happened here was as secure and as privacy preserving as it could potentially be. But how much privacy preservation can you get in a context where the people who are wanting the solutions are essentially hungry for data, because big data is what they do. So that was the scheme. There were some other players on the margins: Google and Apple, the Turing Institute, and of course some other companies as well. So we ended up with the English contact tracing app version 1, as famously or infamously trialed on the Isle of Wight in the month of May. So we had it was based, as all of these are, on Bluetooth. So Bluetooth signals bouncing off other devices between mobile phones. That gives a little, the return of those signals gives a little bit of an indication of how far apart people are or devices are, and that gives some measurements. And people at the National Cybersecurity Centre and people at the Turing Institute have done various in the way of trying to amplify the information in there and make the information in there more secure, more accurate. The NCSC provided security, and within the context of what they had there, as much privacy preservation as was potentially possible. As I said, anyone doing big data is hungry for data. So the Big Data Institute people were happily talking about 60% of people taking up this contact tracing app, and that would allow the whole country to operate as normal again. So we were talking about the country operating as normal again in April of last year, and we were hoping that the app could help for that. Clearly, we have not landed there. As I said, NHSX are techno-solutionists. They think technology will solve the problem, but they were not particularly experienced in data governance, and the party who was experienced in data governance with the NHS was sort of ruled out. The Public Health England had shown their incompetence. The whole test and trace thing, when the tracing app came about, was barely in the picture. Dido Harding was not yet in charge of test and trace at that point, and anything that people wrote about test and trace or wrote about the app was barely connected. The thing that came out of here was a centralized solution, i.e. a solution where mobile phones measure how close they are to other mobile phones and then send that data onto a central place, and the central place then does some analysis on who might be infected on the basis of all this proximity information. And there wasn't a data protection impact assessment on this available until the effort at White really started. So why did this thing fail in the end? There's lots of possible explanations for that, and I'll probably run out of time before talking about all of them in detail. So as already mentioned, there was a letter signed by 200 UK academics in computer science and law mostly. We said at the time, we need to know that this works for the privacy impact of a centralized solution to be worth it. And you need to give us a data protection impact assessment, which is a GDPR requirement, etc. in this sort of context, which would ask questions of proportionality, necessity, coverage of all the possible risks, and data minimization as well. Is it necessary to gather this much data? Is it necessary to do it centrally? Then the data protection impact assessment came out eventually, while the test and White were going on, and some people looked at it and said it was in a dreadful state. There were lots of issues in there. The NCSC, etc., hacking of the Bluetooth measurements made some oversimplifying assumptions. There were stories in the news at one point that the whole thing only worked on 2% of Apple phones. There's a socioeconomic bias in the whole thing, and that wasn't the reason why this one didn't make it. The socioeconomic bias is that these sort of things work very, very well on the slightly more expensive phones, whereas the people who can afford slightly more expensive phones, broadly speaking, are the people at the highest risk of COVID infection, because they do jobs that involve more travel, more public transport, being closer together in small spaces and things like that. Whereas the well-off comfortably can work from home, like us and university people have been doing. In the context of all this, it was all about finding infected people, but Matthew Gold, who was in charge of NHSX, and Ian Levy of GCHQ in various public meetings and writings, came up with all sorts of other useful uses of the data collected, which was against sort of purpose minimization ideas, function creep. Meanwhile, Zulke, on behalf of NHSX, explored a decentralized solution more in line with what other European countries were doing, and in line with the Google and Apple provided interface. I mean, Google and Apple quickly jumped in because they saw the world was creating a surveillance infrastructure that they weren't in charge of. So yes, they came up with their own solution, as people probably know, but that solution didn't work well with what the NHS and NCSC was developing there. So that has been posed by some as a sabotage. And the testing and tracing system wasn't actually equipped to take any data from the contact tracing. So lots of things that might have caused it to fail. I think I'll probably run out of time if I tell you also about the data store, which is being run by some companies with close links to the current government and its advisors, where lots of data is being collected. We don't quite know what it will be used for, because the data protection impact assessment that exists says we need all this data, we need to have all this data, and this is about having the data. So having the data is the right thing, and that's the right purpose. But nobody talks about what happens to the data there. So that's a little bit dubious, especially now the contract on this data store with Palantir has been expanded beyond, well, we hope what's beyond the crisis. So in conclusion, have we successfully sacrificed privacy here to solve COVID? The sacrifice would have been justified in principle, but we don't really know. If you look at the figures that Christopher Fraser produces on the effect of the app versus the data that people like Spiegelhalter look at on the overall effectiveness of testing and tracing, then it can't have made that much of a difference. It probably hasn't avoided the 640,000 cases. There's been a big failure on transparency, which the transparency of data protection impact assessments and in general would be required in this sort of situations. If we're doing more with people's data than normally, we should be more open about it. I haven't seen the AI at work. I have seen no sight of intelligent data-driven interventions. Put it more politely. And on the positive side, the decentralized app that version 2 eventually became had a minimal privacy impact, and it has some brilliant features. But on the other hand, lots of data has also gone to Palantir Factory and that sort of companies with very little effective oversight, either from government and opposition or from the central data protection oversight. So overall, I think no, we've not. The potential was there for something where an enormous amount of privacy was sacrificed for exactly the right reason to gain spectacular results. But it clearly hasn't happened. Okay, I think that's the point to stop.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Erke, for a very engaging and thought-provoking talk about the recent past, and I guess things are still ongoing.